Palestine has been a cause close to my heart for, well, since the 80s. And when it was first explained to me, I couldn't quite believe it. I couldn't quite understand how people could come along and steal a piece of land and be in the right. And then when the peace talks started happening, I couldn't understand, how can you sit down with a thief and negotiate? Surely the thief has to return your property first, and then you sit and talk about what to do with them. So that was the way that I looked at Palestine. I never looked at Palestine in a two-state or a one-state. I just looked at it as get out of that stolen land and then start talking. I just thought that that was probably the simplest way to look at it. Of course, once I put on a hijab and expressed the same sentiment that I've expressed all these years, I was called a radical and an extremist. The next major event with Palestine in my life happened closer to home, and it was I was working for the Newcastle Journal when the Lockerbie air disaster happened, and I was one of the first journalists there. I'd never seen a dead body in my life, and suddenly everywhere I looked in this border town there were dead bodies. It had a very traumatizing effect on me, and at the time the finger of blame was being pointed at a Palestinian leader called Ahmed Jibril. It took more than a year to get an interview, but he finally agreed to meet me, and I went off to Damascus to do this interview with this feared Palestinian leader. And I met Mr. Jibril, and I sat down. And when I look back now, I could cringe with embarrassment. You know, a typical sort of arrogant and ignorant Westerner. He invited me to start the interview. And I said, I was one of the first journalists in Lockerbie. I saw dead bodies. I'd never seen dead bodies before. You have no idea how it traumatized me. The bodies were burnt and broken and bloodied and bloated, and it was terrible, and it's something that I can't ever get out of my mind. And you are being blamed as being the mastermind of this atrocity. And he looked at me and he was shaking with rage as the words were being translated, and he fired back at me and he said, you have been traumatized by one event. He said, every single day we have to pick up the broken bodies of our children, the broken bodies of our wives, our loved ones, out of the rubble, killed by Israeli bullets, killed by Israeli bombs. And he said, this is the reality of being a Palestinian. This is our reality, day in, day out. It happens to you once and you can't live with it. Imagine how we feel. And as I listened to the translation coming back, I wanted to find a hole in the ground to disappear, because I realized how insensitive and arrogant I had been to go to him and tell him how traumatized I was with one event in my life. But this is the reality of being a Palestinian. Living with death is a reality every single day, 24/7. A couple of years ago, I was addressing some students in Bristol University. There was about 20 of them, very fresh-faced and political students. And they asked me about Palestine, and they started to get onto the issue of suicide bombers. And they said, you know, this is terrible. What motivates a young person to give up their life like this? And I looked at them and I said, okay. I said, the trouble is when you read the newspapers, you just hear about a suicide bomber. You don't know the name of the person, you don't know their circumstances, you don't know what happened in the events leading up to what they did. And I said, but let me tell you the story of one young man. His father came home from they lived in the West Bank. He came home and said to the family that he had been diagnosed with cancer. Now, cancer puts the fear of God into everybody, regardless of where they live. And he told his family, it's not totally bad news. It is curable. I have a prescription here and I have to go to the hospital. It's only half a mile away, and with continued treatment, I will be cured, inshallah. And so this is how he faced this terrible disease. And so he set off to go for his first treatment. Between his home and the hospital was an Israeli checkpoint. He never got beyond the Israeli checkpoint. They made fun of him, they tore up his medical papers, they told him to go away, and he went back home. And he said, tomorrow, inshallah, I will go. And he went back again the next day, and the next day, and the next day. And I'm saying to these students, imagine this is your father. The man who cradled you when you were young, the man who you looked up to as the rock, as the protector, as the provider. Imagine this is your father. And every day he's coming back going, I can't get past the checkpoint. Then he came back and he said, unfortunately, the cancer has become aggressive and it's incurable now. That young man had to watch his father die. Imagine this is your father. And I said to the students, come on, what are you going to do? This is your father. What are you going to do? And one of them put his hand up and he said, well, I would write to the UN. The United Nations. Israel has violated and ignored more United Nations resolutions than any other country in the world. Saddam was invaded because he violated and ignored 12 resolutions. Israel has violated and ignored 174 resolutions. Do you think that the United Nations can make Israel do anything to save your father? Come on, think of something better. Another one said, I would write to my MP. And they came out with various suggestions, and then they fell silent because they knew that, like that young man, there was nothing they could do. And to make it worse because of the siege and the brutality of Zionism, even something like painkillers couldn't get through. So not only did his cancer become incurable, but the young man had to watch his father die a slow and agonizing death. Now, I don't know if anybody in here has had a relative who's had a terminal illness. I'm sure the end wasn't very pleasant, but imagine being denied painkillers. He watched his father die a slow, agonizing death because the checkpoint, less than half a mile away, refused, laughed, ridiculed this poor man who could have been cured, who could have gone on to maintain his family, to be the rock, to be the provider. Eventually, the young man put on a suicide belt and he went to the checkpoint and he blew himself up. Then I said to the students, I said, does anybody now want to criticize this young man? We can't justify the actions of suicide bombers, but do you want to criticize him now? And they still remained silent. This is the reality of Palestine. We have to change that reality. We have to give these people hope. And the only way that we can do it is by destroying Zionism. And we can do it in many different ways. But forget the politicians. They've had more than 60 years. And in the 60 years that they have been talking, Israel has grabbed more and more land. The settlements have increased in size. In fact, for those fools who still talk about a two-state solution, you just have to look at Palestine now and see that it is not a reality. It is impossible. There is no way that you can have a two-state solution. But there is one solution, and that is forcing the politicians to do something. And if they won't act, then we have to act for them. The Mavi Marmara. That flotilla did more to change things in the Middle East, to change the perceptions, the reality in the Middle East than any other political action. Tony Blair, the most useless man on the planet, the most redundant man on the planet, Middle East peace envoy, he has achieved nothing, absolutely nothing. Those 9 men who were martyred, those brothers who were martyred on the flotilla, they did more to change events for Palestine. They brought world attention, they brought world condemnation. Israel is now isolated. The Zionist project is failed. It's only a matter of time before it implodes. And it's up to us to finally make sure that it goes in its entirety. Now, I'm not saying get rid of all the Jews from the region. Jews and Christians and Muslims have lived in that region alongside each other for hundreds and hundreds of years and have known nothing but peace. Israel is just over 60 years old, and it has brought nothing but hatred. It has been on a footing of war every single day for more than 60 years. You cannot keep up that existence. And it's not just Palestinian land it's after. And the reality is that they want the Euphrates to the Nile. Believe it. They're not satisfied with that little piece of Palestine. They're not satisfied with being the size of a South African game reserve. They want the land from the Euphrates to the Nile, a greater Israel. We can stop it. We can stop it with boycotts. We can stop it with convoys, with aid. Not because the aid is replacing anything. It's not. It's a drop in the ocean. But it's public awareness. The Hope Convoy is going to travel right across North Africa. And all along the way, people are going to be drawn into the cause of Palestine. All of these initiatives have nothing to do with the politicians and everything to do with ordinary people like you and I. And it's people power that can bring about a change. Never, ever underestimate your own abilities. We can't all go out and pay the blood price and be martyred like the heroes on the Mavi Marmara. We can't necessarily get behind a steering wheel and drive all the way to Palestine because we have other things, but there's nothing to stop you from signing a paper tonight to become a member of an organisation that is making a change in Palestine. There's nothing to stop you from writing letters to the newspapers, to the younger ones here who are handy on the internet. Start blogs, get on Facebooks, get the message out there. Do whatever you can, because you are the ones who can make the changes, not the politicians. And when the people start to lead, that's when the leaders start to follow. And if they don't, they become irrelevant, and they know this only too well, which is why we're now beginning to see a change in the rhetoric from politicians. Very few these days stand up and say, I support Israel. Very, very few of them will do that today. And that's because people like you are watching them, are listening to them, and are warning them. Follow us and we'll vote for you in the next election. We'll support your campaign. Don't follow us and you will become irrelevant. They're beginning to realise that now. So never ever underestimate your own abilities.
Palestine!